Our thanks to Dr. Laura McNeil. Well, Dr. Charmaine Jackman now, founder of InnoPsych Inc., a directory for therapists, is here to break down the psychology of bias in law enforcement. Dr. Jackman, welcome back to BNC. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Brittany. It's good to be here.
And so, Dr. Jackman, we hear this all the time, that implicit and explicit bias can influence interactions between police and certain communities. Could you break down which form of bias is harder to identify and can be especially dangerous?
Sure. So implicit bias is that unconscious attitudes and judgments that we have that impact onto other people. These are often we're not aware; they're not within our awareness. Explicit bias are more overt prejudices that we hold about people from other groups. These might be outright refusals, for example, to serve someone in a restaurant or someone who's come to your place of business. Explicit and easy to see. The implicit biases are those unconscious attitudes again, and sometimes we don't even recognize that's what implicit. And they really determine how we respond to people, often cross-culturally, but often also within our own groups.
And so talk about hidden bias can also be dangerous during court trials when it comes to jury selection. As the nation follows the Derek Chauvin trial, which Dr. Laura just mentioned earlier, do you think any hidden bias could, impact this negatively in the case?
Yeah, the reality is that we always, there's no doubt about that. And really, there's been a lot of around jury selection and the biases that we hold about people from other groups, people that don't look like us. And so that's really important, as both sides do their own jury selection. And those implicit biases often play a role. And we have to be intentional about naming them, right? Mm-hmm. What are the assumptions that I have about someone who doesn't look like me in order to really address them? If we pretend that they're not there, it's really insidious and they're really hard to break from those.
And Dr. Jackman, do you believe police departments see the connection between implicit bias and actually the way certain racial groups are handled in police custody?
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation. There's a lot of research around that. So it's there. It's, people know about it. Some departments have implicit bias trainings. But the reality is that it's, these things are so ingrained, sometimes from childhood. And it can take a lot. Again, we have to be engaged in conscious efforts to continually overcome those implicit biases that we have.
And some police departments have turned to implicit or impact bias training to help reverse these behaviors. How effective is this training on people who have deeply rooted issues, as you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think, again, it really depends on how the people are engaged. I think, there's often a lot of negative association with this implicit bias training. People don't really want to engage with it. So one, it takes the person or the individuals come into this trainings with an open approach, an open mind, and really wanted to make a change. The reality, though, is if the implicit bias is something that's separate from their typical police training, then it's not going to really be that effective. Mm-hmm. To really have long-term impact on these trainings, the information has to be embedded in the police training. But not only there, they also have to be embedded in the police structures and their policies and how they practice their policing.
And we know that's why so many
people...
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
I was going to say, imagine that. When we think about, there's been some research that's really addressing these issues. Some people in Seattle area, for example, have done some research, and they've thought about some of the policies, for example, in addressing police brutality. One thing they recommend is police who are engaged in a foot chase of someone they're going to arrest, that they not be then, once they get to the scene, that they not be in charge of arresting that individual. The reality is when we get triggered, right, our body goes in, to the state of this fight flight, and our reasoning stops. Yeah. If you've ever been in a scary situation, you don't often remember like what you did or things chronologically because your body is just in that survival mode. So having police officers who engage in the foot chase, not be the ones who arrest the person, that can have some impact. Because again, once your body's engaged and activated and adrenaline is going, people often get in situations where they actually cause harm, and this police brutality is more easier to come to bear.
And that's what so many people want to see change, right? So what can law enforcement do to actually manage this behavior?
There are lots of things, right? There are lots of things that they can do. And again, it has to be, one, the approach that it cannot be this separate training from the regular or typical police training. It has to be really integrated and embedded in the police training. It also has to start from the top, right? What is the culture of the organization? What is the culture of the police department? So really looking at that. What are our policies and practices, and how do they impact how we connect and relate to people from other cultural groups? In Boston, probably about 20 years ago, there was this real movement around community policing, and that had a lot of impact in reducing crime rates. And part of it is that the police who were engaged or working in particular neighborhoods got to know the people in those neighborhoods. So when you are able to make contact with people, the assumptions that you make, these automatic assumptions that you make about whole groups, when you see people and get to know them individually, those stereotypes and those assumptions, start to fade away as you have contact with people. So having those community policing policies have really been helpful. Also, again, hiring more diverse officers. So again, we really want to look at that from these assumptions that we make, often because we don't have a lot of contact with each other. And so if we have a police force that's diverse, we're less likely to continue to perpetuate some of those implicit biases about the people who are there to serve and protect.
And we know so much of that is how you help build the trust back into the Black community. Well, Dr. Charmaine Jackman, thank you so much for dropping all of that knowledge for us tonight. We appreciate your time.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Brittany.